Nurse Jennifer had always been known for her fast-paced, no-nonsense approach to her job. She was efficient and expected the same from her patients, or so she thought. The hospital was a busy place, and time was always of the essence. Jennifer had a schedule to keep, and sometimes it felt like there was no time for anything other than moving from one patient to the next. One day, she was assigned to care for Mrs. Evelyn, an elderly woman who had been admitted for a routine procedure. Mrs. Evelyn wasn't in the best of health, and her frailty was apparent. She moved slowly, needing help with almost everything. As Jennifer entered the room that morning, she could already sense that today was going to be different. Mrs. Evelyn lay in bed, a little confused about the time and place. She had trouble remembering what was happening or why she was there. Jennifer approached the patient with a clipboard in hand, ready to go through her usual checks. But she quickly noticed that Mrs. Evelyn was struggling to even sit up. She moved her hand gently to help, but the elderly woman's trembling arms made it harder than Jennifer had expected. "Come on, we don't have all day," Jennifer muttered under her breath, as she pulled the blanket away and attempted to help Mrs. Evelyn sit up. She was running behind on her rounds, and every second felt like it counted. Mrs. Evelyn tried to speak, but her voice was soft and unsteady. "I'm sorry, dear. I don't quite understand," Mrs. Evelyn said with a shaky breath, her words barely audible. Jennifer sighed, impatient with the delay. "It's simple. Just sit up like this," she demonstrated, her tone sharp, without realizing how cold it sounded. She quickly adjusted the elderly woman's position on the bed, not bothering to check if she was comfortable or if she needed time. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't speak. She had been treated this way before in other hospitals and clinics, but it still stung every time. The way Jennifer was rushing through her care made her feel insignificant, as though her needs were nothing more than a task to be completed. It wasn't the first time she had been looked down upon for her age and condition, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Jennifer was too focused on her own schedule to notice the hurt she was causing. She quickly moved to the next task, taking Mrs. Evelyn's blood pressure without much concern for how the patient felt. "Hold still," she commanded, pressing the cuff tightly around her arm. Mrs. Evelyn flinched, her frailty causing her to feel more vulnerable with every movement. But Jennifer, her attention elsewhere, didn't notice. She jotted down the readings on her chart and moved on to the next task, barely pausing to check if Mrs. Evelyn was feeling okay or if she needed any comfort. It wasn't just the physical actions that were hard for Mrs. Evelyn. It was the way Jennifer spoke to her, like she was a burden. The sharpness in Jennifer's tone made it clear that she didn't have time for the elderly woman's confusion or delays. To Jennifer, this was just another part of her shift, another patient to check off the list. After finishing her routine, Jennifer quickly moved on to her next patient. She didn't stop to think about the way Mrs. Evelyn had looked at her, the silent tears that had streamed down the elderly woman's face, or the hurt that was left behind after her rushed care. To Jennifer, it was just part of the job. But for Mrs. Evelyn, the experience was more than that. It was a reminder of her growing isolation, of the way she was treated simply because of her age and her health. The sting of Jennifer's harshness stayed with her long after the nurse had left the room. This expanded version keeps the focus on Jennifer's actions while making sure that the story remains engaging and nonviolent. Would you like me to continue in this style for the following parts? The hours passed slowly for Mrs. Evelyn after Nurse Jennifer had left. She lay in her bed, feeling a sense of loneliness that seemed to grow with every minute. The hospital room, once a place of care and comfort, now felt more like a prison. Mrs. Evelyn had been in and out of hospitals for years, and she knew all too well what it felt like to be ignored. But something about Jennifer's sharp words and cold touch made it hurt more than usual. She tried to push the thoughts aside, telling herself it wasn't the nurse's fault. She had seen plenty of nurses come and go over the years. Some were kind, some were indifferent, but none of them seemed to truly see her. Still, Jennifer's behavior lingered in her mind. The way the nurse rushed through everything, as though Mrs. Evelyn's presence didn't matter, left a bitter taste in her mouth. It wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, but it still stung. As the day wore on, Mrs. Evelyn couldn't help but feel the weight of her age. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of her body. It was the mental toll of being forgotten, of being viewed as nothing more than a task. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the glass of water on the bedside table, but her fingers didn't have the strength they once did. She let out a soft sigh, frustrated by her own weakness. She wished she could be more independent, but at her age, it was harder every day. In the hallway outside, the noise of the hospital continued. Nurses moved from room to room, doctors conversed in hurried voices, and visitors came and went. But Mrs. Evelyn felt like an invisible presence in it all, a silent figure no one took the time to notice. It was hard for her to admit, but there were times when she longed for someone to speak to her with kindness, to treat her as more than just another patient. Just then, the door to her room opened, and she looked up to see a familiar face. Her son, Mayor Thomas. His calm, reassuring presence immediately brought a sense of relief. He was always so kind to her, always making the effort to ensure she felt loved and cared for. Unlike Nurse Jennifer, who had been too focused on her schedule to notice anything about her patient, Thomas was different. He had a way of making her feel important, even when she felt like a burden. "Hi, Mom," Thomas said softly as he walked into the room. He pulled a chair next to her bed and sat down, giving her a warm smile. "How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Evelyn smiled faintly, her heart lightening just from his presence. "I'm okay, dear. Just a little tired. That's all." She didn't want to worry him with her thoughts about the nurse, though she couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort when she thought of how she had been treated earlier. Thomas noticed the slight sadness in her eyes, though. He had always been able to read her well. "You know, you don't have to go through this alone," he said, taking her hand gently. "I'm here for you." Mrs. Evelyn felt a wave of gratitude. Her son had always been there for her, even when life had been tough. He didn't treat her as if she were fragile or incapable. He saw her for who she was, a strong woman who had lived a full life, even if her body didn't reflect it anymore. But as much as she appreciated her son's visit, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the way she had been treated by others. It was as though, once you reached a certain age, people stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you only as a task. Mrs. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder how many others in the hospital felt the same way. After a while, Thomas kissed her on the forehead and promised to visit again soon. As he left, Mrs. Evelyn lay back against her pillows, her mind still preoccupied with the events of the day. But now, at least, she had the comfort of knowing her son cared. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her through another long day. This expansion keeps the tone focused on the emotional experience of Mrs. Evelyn without any violent or violated content. Let me know if you need further adjustments or if you'd like to continue. The following day, Nurse Jennifer was back on her rounds, moving quickly through the halls, checking patient rooms, and handling various tasks. She didn't think much about the previous day's interactions with Mrs. Evelyn. To her, it was just another part of her shift, another patient to care for and move on from. But today would be different. As Jennifer approached Mrs. Evelyn's room, she didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. She had a checklist in hand, ready to move through the usual procedures. But as she entered the room, she saw something that made her pause. Mayor Thomas was sitting next to his mother's bed. He was reading something on his phone, quietly speaking to Mrs. Evelyn, who was listening intently. Jennifer hadn't realized that Mrs. Evelyn had such an important visitor. The sight of the mayor sitting there with his mother struck Jennifer in an unexpected way. She didn't know much about Mrs. Evelyn, other than that she was elderly and in for a procedure. But seeing her in this context, with her son who held a position of authority in the town, made Jennifer rethink her previous judgments. Jennifer cleared her throat as she stepped into the room. "Excuse me, Mrs. Evelyn," she said, her voice slightly more tentative than usual. "I'm here to check on you." Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting Jennifer's for a brief moment. "Oh, you must be Nurse Jennifer," he said calmly. His tone was friendly, but there was something in his eyes that Jennifer couldn't quite place. Yes, that's me," Jennifer replied, unsure of how to respond. She quickly shifted her attention back to Mrs. Evelyn. "How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Evelyn gave a small smile, but Jennifer could see the faint traces of exhaustion in her eyes. The previous day's interaction still lingered in the back of her mind, but Jennifer didn't mention it. Instead, she went through the usual routine, taking Mrs. Evelyn's vitals and asking a few basic questions about her comfort level. But as Jennifer moved about the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. There was an air of importance in the room now, a sense of dignity that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Evelyn wasn't just another elderly patient anymore. She was the mother of the mayor, someone with a presence that Jennifer hadn't fully understood until now. As Jennifer finished her tasks, she tried to maintain a professional demeanor, but she could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. She had been so focused on the efficiency of her work that she hadn't taken the time to see the people in front of her. And now, in this moment, she was confronted with the reality that she had misjudged Mrs. Evelyn. This elderly woman who was more than just a patient, but someone with a family and a life that mattered. Before Jennifer left the room, Mayor Thomas stood up, walking over to his mother's side. "Thank you for taking care of my mom," he said to Jennifer, his voice sincere but firm. Jennifer nodded quickly, though she could feel her face flush with a mix of guilt and embarrassment. "Of course, it's my job." As she left the room, Jennifer couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. She hadn't expected to be confronted with the mayor in such a personal way. It made her realize that her treatment of Mrs. Evelyn, as just another task on her busy schedule, hadn't been fair. Jennifer had been so wrapped up in her own efficiency that she hadn't taken the time to see the humanity in the people she was caring for. The encounter with the mayor left Jennifer feeling uneasy. She was still focused on her work, but the experience had shifted something in her. It was a reminder that everyone had a story, a life that mattered. And it wasn't her place to reduce anyone to just another patient to check off her list. As Jennifer moved on to the next room, her mind kept returning to the brief moment with Mrs. Evelyn and her son, and for the first time, Jennifer realized that the people she cared for were more than just names on a chart. They were individuals, each with their own life and dignity, deserving of respect. This expanded version keeps the narrative engaging while maintaining the focus on Jennifer's realization and growth. Let me know if you'd like to continue or adjust any parts. The next day, Nurse Jennifer was making her usual rounds, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease from the previous day. The memory of Mrs. Evelyn and her son, Mayor Thomas, had stayed with her. She had never thought much about the elderly woman, but the way she had been treated, and the realization of who she really was weighed on Jennifer. She was determined to do better, to make sure she treated her patients with the kindness and respect they deserved. As Jennifer entered Mrs. Evelyn's room once again, she was greeted by the sight of the elderly woman sitting up in bed, looking a little more alert than the last time they had met. Mrs. Evelyn smiled when she saw Jennifer, and this time, Jennifer couldn't help but notice the quiet strength in her eyes. She was no longer just a frail patient. There was something more to her, something Jennifer had missed before. "Good morning, Mrs. Evelyn," Jennifer said, her voice softer than it had been the day before. She had learned something important over the past 24 hours, and it was reflected in the way she spoke now. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Evelyn replied, her voice warm, but tinged with a slight tremor. "How are you today?" Jennifer smiled, trying to hide the guilt she still felt. "I'm doing well, thank you. And you? How are you feeling?" Mrs. Evelyn nodded slowly. "A little better today. I'm just glad to have some company." She paused for a moment, her eyes glancing toward the door as if she were thinking of something. Jennifer busied herself with checking Mrs. Evelyn's vitals, taking the time to do it carefully and with attention. She was trying to make up for the rush of the previous day, hoping that her actions would show how sorry she was for her earlier behavior. As Jennifer worked, she couldn't help but remember the conversation she had overheard between Mrs. Evelyn and her son, the mayor. She had never realized how much influence and power Mrs. Evelyn's family held. Mayor Thomas was a prominent figure, and Jennifer had felt a little out of place, but it wasn't the mayor's power that made her reflect. It was the love between them. Thomas had treated his mother with a gentleness that Jennifer had seldom seen in her busy, fast-paced environment. It made her realize that there was more to every patient than just their condition. After finishing her checks, Jennifer pulled a chair over to Mrs. Evelyn's bedside and sat down. She wanted to do more than just perform her duties today. She wanted to make a real connection, something she had never truly made with her patients before. "You have a lovely son, Mrs. Evelyn," she said softly, her tone genuine. "He's a good man." Mrs. Evelyn smiled warmly at the mention of her son. "Yes, he is. I'm very proud of him," she said, her eyes glistening with pride. "He's always been kind to me, even when life was hard." Jennifer felt a twinge of guilt again, realizing how much she had overlooked. She had been so focused on efficiency, on ticking off tasks, that she had never stopped to learn about the people she was caring for. But sitting here now with Mrs. Evelyn, Jennifer could see the depth of her character, the strength that came from a lifetime of experiences. She was more than just an elderly woman. She was a mother, a caregiver, someone who had given so much of herself. "Do you think he'll come by later today?" Jennifer asked, not wanting to sound too intrusive but curious about the connection between mother and son. Mrs. Evelyn's face softened. "I'm sure he will. He always finds time for me, no matter how busy he gets." Jennifer nodded, her heart warming at the thought. It was a small moment, but it was significant to her. She realized that she wanted to be the kind of caregiver who didn't just see patients as tasks. She wanted to be the kind of person who understood that behind every hospital gown was a story, a life filled with memories and emotions. She wanted to truly care. As she finished her time with Mrs. Evelyn, Jennifer felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew she couldn't undo her past mistakes, but she could make the choice every day to do better. She wasn't just a nurse. She was someone who had the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives, to show compassion where it was needed most. Before she left the room, Jennifer looked at Mrs. Evelyn one last time and smiled. "Take care, Mrs. Evelyn. I'll be back later to check on you." Mrs. Evelyn smiled back, her eyes filled with a quiet appreciation. "Thank you, dear. I'm glad you're here." As Jennifer closed the door behind her, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt before. She had learned something valuable today. It wasn't just about medicine or efficiency. It was about people, about kindness, and about treating everyone with the respect they deserved. This version expands on Jennifer's realization and growth while keeping the tone gentle and engaging. The following day, Nurse Jennifer entered Mrs. Evelyn's room, determined to do things differently. Her earlier interactions with the elderly woman weighed heavily on her mind, and after reflecting on her behavior, she was resolved to treat her patients with more kindness and understanding. She had spent the night thinking about Mrs. Evelyn's family and how much her son, Mayor Thomas, cared for her. That memory made Jennifer realize how little she had truly understood the lives of the people she was supposed to care for. When Jennifer entered the room, she was greeted by the sight of Mrs. Evelyn sitting up in bed, looking slightly more alert than before. She had a soft smile on her face, but Jennifer could still see the weariness in her eyes. It seemed like Mrs. Evelyn was doing her best to be positive despite her challenges. The small act of sitting up, though it might seem insignificant to most people, was an achievement for her. Jennifer took a deep breath, hoping to make a positive impression today. "Good morning, Mrs. Evelyn. How are you feeling today?" Jennifer asked, her voice softer than usual, a genuine smile accompanying her words. Mrs. Evelyn's smile widened, though there was still a hint of sadness in her expression. "I'm doing better, dear. Just a little tired. But I'm grateful for the little progress." Jennifer nodded, her heart feeling lighter. She was pleased to see that Mrs. Evelyn was doing better, even if it was just a small improvement. It was a reminder that every step, no matter how small, counted. Jennifer set aside her clipboard and walked over to the window, adjusting the blinds slightly to let in more light. As she stood by the window, Jennifer thought about the mayor's visit the day before. She had heard his gentle voice and seen the way he interacted with his mother. So calm, so compassionate. It was a stark contrast to the rush and impersonal care that Jennifer had been offering. She felt a surge of guilt. How could she have treated someone so important? Someone with a family that cared deeply for her, with such impatience. She had been too focused on her checklist and her speed, forgetting the humanity behind every patient's face. Turning back to Mrs. Evelyn, Jennifer asked, "Would you like some more water or anything else, Mrs. Evelyn? I'll make sure you're comfortable today." Mrs. Evelyn looked at her with a kind smile. "No, thank you, dear. But I do appreciate you taking the time to talk with me." Jennifer felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't taken the time to truly talk with Mrs. Evelyn before. She had always been so busy, so caught up in the daily rush of the hospital, that she never paused to ask how her patients were really feeling or what they needed emotionally. The door opened just then, and Jennifer turned around to see Mayor Thomas standing in the doorway. He gave her a polite nod but didn't say anything immediately. He was holding a small gift wrapped in paper, a book of some kind, and Jennifer assumed it was for his mother. "Good morning, Mayor," Jennifer said, smiling at him. "I was just checking in on your mother." "Thank you, Nurse Jennifer," Thomas replied warmly, his voice calm and steady. "I appreciate you taking care of her. She's in good hands." There was a pause as Jennifer and the mayor exchanged glances. She felt a bit self-conscious, knowing that he was probably aware of the way she had treated his mother the day before, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he simply smiled and placed the book gently on Mrs. Evelyn's bed. "I thought you might enjoy reading this," Thomas said to his mother, his tone tender. "It's a new novel I thought you'd like." Mrs. Evelyn's face brightened as she took the book, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you, Thomas. This will keep me entertained for a while." Jennifer watched the exchange between mother and son, and it was then that she truly understood the depth of their bond. Mayor Thomas wasn't just the mayor. He was a son who loved his mother, who cared about her comfort, and who wanted nothing more than to see her happy and healthy. Jennifer realized that it wasn't enough to just take care of people's physical needs. It was about understanding and recognizing their emotional and personal needs as well. As Jennifer watched the scene unfold, she felt a strong desire to do better. She couldn't change the past, but she could start fresh today. She could make sure that every patient she interacted with felt respected, seen, and cared for. There was no rush, no task too urgent that it couldn't wait for a moment of kindness. She had learned an important lesson, one that would stay with her for the rest of her career. Every person in that hospital, no matter their age or status, deserved to be treated with dignity and compassion. Before leaving, Jennifer smiled at Mrs. Evelyn. "I'll check on you later, Mrs. Evelyn. I hope you enjoy your book." Mrs. Evelyn gave her a warm, appreciative smile. "Thank you, dear. The days passed by, and Jennifer couldn't help but think about how much she had learned in such a short time. The events with Mrs. Evelyn, her son Mayor Thomas, and the way she had treated both of them had changed something inside her. Every time she entered a patient's room now, she didn't just see a task to be completed or a name on a chart. She saw a person, someone with a story and a life that mattered. But that didn't make things easy for Jennifer. She was still adjusting to this new way of thinking, and there were moments when she caught herself slipping back into old habits. There were moments when the pace of the hospital would overwhelm her, and she'd have to remind herself to slow down, to truly connect with the people she was caring for. But every time she faltered, she would think back to Mrs. Evelyn's kind smile, to the way the elderly woman's eyes had lit up when her son visited. It was a reminder that the small gestures, The moments of compassion were what truly mattered. One afternoon, as Jennifer was walking down the corridor, she saw Mayor Thomas standing near the nurse's station, speaking with one of the other nurses. His presence caught her attention, and she hesitated for a moment, wondering if he would recognize her and how he might feel about the way she had treated his mother in the past. But before she could think too much about it, Thomas turned his head and saw her. "Good afternoon, Nurse Jennifer," Thomas said, his voice warm, but with a hint of formality. "I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for all that you've done for my mother. She's been feeling much better these past few days." Jennifer felt a wave of guilt, but she managed to smile, grateful that he wasn't bringing up the way she had acted before. "I'm so glad to hear that, Mayor. It's been a pleasure looking after her." Thomas nodded, then glanced down the hallway toward his mother's room. "I know she can be difficult sometimes, but she's always been a fighter. I just want to make sure she has the best care possible." Jennifer's heart warmed at his words. She had seen firsthand how much Thomas cared for his mother, and it made her feel even more determined to be the kind of nurse who could live up to that level of care. "You're doing a wonderful job," Jennifer said, meaning it. "It's clear how much she means to you." The conversation felt different this time. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just a mutual respect between them. It was a small moment, but it left Jennifer feeling like she was on the right path. She was starting to understand that her job was about more than just medical care. It was about being there for people in their moments of vulnerability, offering not just physical treatment, but emotional support as well. Later that afternoon, Jennifer returned to Mrs. Evelyn's room. She knocked softly before entering, and when Mrs. Evelyn looked up, Jennifer smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Evelyn. How are you today?" The elderly woman gave her a bright smile, her eyes twinkling with gratitude. "I'm feeling much better today, dear. It's so good to see you again." Jennifer felt a rush of relief. She had been worried about how Mrs. Evelyn would feel after the changes she had made in her approach. But Mrs. Evelyn's kindness reassured her that she was on the right track. She took a moment to check the elderly woman's vitals, making sure everything was in order. As she worked, she noticed that Mrs. Evelyn seemed to be in higher spirits than usual. "I'm so glad to see you in such good spirits," Jennifer said as she adjusted Mrs. Evelyn's blanket. "Have you been able to read the book your son brought you?" Mrs. Evelyn nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, I've been reading it every day. It's a nice distraction. Thomas always knows what to bring me. He has such a good heart." Jennifer felt a pang of admiration for the bond between mother and son. It was clear that their relationship was built on love and mutual respect, and it made Jennifer think about her own family. She hadn't been in touch with her parents as much as she should have been lately, caught up in the whirlwind of work and life. But seeing the care Thomas showed for his mother made Jennifer want to be more present in the lives of the people she loved. As Jennifer finished her checkup, she found herself speaking more gently, more attentively. She didn't rush through the tasks like she used to. She took her time, making sure Mrs. Evelyn was comfortable and that her needs were met, both physical and emotional. They talked for a while about the book and the things Mrs. Evelyn liked to do when she wasn't in the hospital. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it felt genuine, and Jennifer realized that this was the kind of connection she had been missing. Before she left, Jennifer looked at Mrs. Evelyn one last time, a smile on her face. "I'll be back later to check on you again, Mrs. Evelyn. Take care." A few days later, Nurse Jennifer found herself standing outside Mrs. Evelyn's room again. As she had promised, she'd been making sure to visit more often, taking the time to chat with Mrs. Evelyn and check on her progress. The elderly woman's health seemed to be improving, and with each visit, Jennifer's sense of responsibility grew. But this time, there was something different about her approach. She wasn't just completing tasks or running through a checklist. She wanted to make sure Mrs. Evelyn felt seen, valued, and cared for. Jennifer took a deep breath before she knocked lightly on the door. She was nervous, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. Mrs. Evelyn had been kind to her, accepting of the changes Jennifer had made in her approach. Still, there was a lingering doubt in Jennifer's mind about whether her efforts had truly made a difference. But today, she was determined to show that she was more than just a nurse doing her job. She wanted to be someone who truly connected with her patients. When Mrs. Evelyn answered the door, she smiled warmly at Jennifer, her face lighting up with a quiet joy. "Good afternoon, dear. You're here a little earlier than usual today." Jennifer smiled back, feeling a warm sense of familiarity. "I thought I'd stop by early today. I wanted to make sure you're comfortable." Mrs. Evelyn nodded, her eyes soft with gratitude. "That's very thoughtful of you, Jennifer. I appreciate it." Jennifer walked into the room, taking a moment to adjust the blinds to let in more light. She noticed that Mrs. Evelyn's room had a sense of calm to it today, neatly arranged, with the little touches that made it feel like home. It was clear that Mrs. Evelyn was someone who valued comfort and routine, even in a place like the hospital. "Do you need anything before I check your vitals?" Jennifer asked, her tone gentle. Mrs. Evelyn shook her head, though her smile remained. "No, dear. I'm just happy to have someone to talk to. The days can be long in here." Jennifer felt a pang of sympathy. She knew what it was like to feel isolated, even when surrounded by people. Mrs. Evelyn's words reminded her of how easy it was to take for granted the simple comforts of companionship and human connection. Jennifer set aside her clipboard for a moment, taking a seat beside the bed. "Well, I'm happy to keep you company for a while," Jennifer said, settling in. "Anything on your mind today?" Mrs. Evelyn seemed to think for a moment before she spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about my son. He's been so good to me, always looking out for me. But I know he has his own life, his own responsibilities. I don't want to be a burden to him." Jennifer's heart softened as she listened. It was clear that Mrs. Evelyn loved her son deeply, but there was a trace of concern in her voice. Concern that she was taking up too much of his time and energy. It was a sentiment that many elderly people shared, feeling as though they were somehow becoming a burden on those they loved. "You're never a burden to him," Jennifer said gently. "I can see how much he cares about you, and I'm sure he wouldn't have it any other way." Mrs. Evelyn smiled at Jennifer's words, a hint of relief washing over her. "You're right, dear. I know he would never say it, but I can see it in the way he looks after me." Jennifer felt her admiration for the relationship between mother and son grow even stronger. It wasn't just about the care Thomas provided. It was about the bond they shared. It was clear that their love for each other wasn't based on obligation. It was built on genuine care and respect. After checking Mrs. Evelyn's vitals, Jennifer took a moment to sit back and reflect. She had learned so much from this experience. She had learned that her role as a nurse was about more than just the physical aspects of care. It was about being present, truly listening, and offering comfort wherever it was needed. She had also learned the importance of not rushing through life, of taking the time to connect with others. Before she left the room, Jennifer looked at Mrs. Evelyn and smiled. "I'll be back later to check on you, but if you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know. I'm always happy to help." Mrs. Evelyn nodded, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "Thank you, Jennifer. You've made my day brighter, as always." As Jennifer closed the door behind her and walked down the hallway, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had started this journey unsure of herself, unsure of her role in the lives of her patients. But now she felt confident in the knowledge that she was making a real difference, not just in the physical health of her patients, but in their emotional well-being too. It was a small shift, but one that had a lasting impact, and Jennifer knew she was on the right path. Days passed, and Jennifer's approach to her work continued to evolve. She had spent so much time focusing on the technical aspects of nursing, the vitals, the procedures, the tasks. But now, her focus had shifted. Every patient was a person, not just a diagnosis to treat. She had learned this lesson through her interactions with Mrs. Evelyn. And though she still had a lot to learn, she felt more confident in her ability to connect with her patients on a deeper level. It had been a week since the last time Jennifer had spent a long, thoughtful conversation with Mrs. Evelyn. She had been checking in on her regularly, making sure she was comfortable and helping with whatever she needed. But today, as she walked down the hallway toward Mrs. Evelyn's room, she felt a sense of anticipation, as if today was going to be different. She wasn't sure why, but something inside her told her it was going to be an important day. When Jennifer entered the room, she was greeted by Mrs. Evelyn's warm smile. The elderly woman was sitting up in bed, looking peaceful as she glanced out the window. There was a softness about her today, less tired, more at ease. "Good morning, Mrs. Evelyn," Jennifer said gently, setting her clipboard aside. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm feeling better, Jennifer," Mrs. Evelyn replied, her voice strong but calm. "Thank you for asking. You've been so kind to me these past few days." Jennifer smiled, her heart swelling with pride. It felt good to know that her efforts had made a difference. "I'm glad to hear that. I've been thinking a lot about our conversations, and I just wanted to let you know how much I appreciate your perspective. You've taught me a lot." Mrs. Evelyn's eyes twinkled with understanding. "I think we teach each other, dear. That's how life works, isn't it? We all have something to offer, no matter our age or stage in life." The words hit Jennifer deeper than she had expected. It was true. Mrs. Evelyn had spent her life giving, loving, and caring for others, yet here she was, teaching Jennifer something valuable. It was a reminder that no one was ever too old to learn or to offer wisdom. Every person had something meaningful to share. As Jennifer finished checking Mrs. Evelyn's vitals, they talked about life, about the things that mattered to them, the memories they held dear. Jennifer learned that Mrs. Evelyn had been a teacher for many years before retiring, and she had a passion for gardening and reading. She had lived a full, rich life, filled with moments of love, joy, and hardship. It was so easy to forget that these were the stories of the people who came through the hospital doors. They weren't just patients, they were people with histories, dreams, and legacies. "I'm so glad I've had the chance to get to know you better, Mrs. Evelyn," Jennifer said as she finished her work. "It's been truly rewarding." The elderly woman smiled warmly. "And I'm glad you've taken the time to listen. Sometimes that's all we really need, to be heard, to be understood." As Jennifer prepared to leave the room, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had learned a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her career. It wasn't about how many tasks she could check off or how quickly she could move through her rounds. It was about the relationships she built with her patients, the connections she made with them. It was about showing kindness and compassion, truly seeing them as individuals, not just as medical cases. Before leaving, Jennifer turned to Mrs. Evelyn one last time. "I'll be back to check on you tomorrow, but if you need anything before then, don't hesitate to call for me." Mrs. Evelyn's eyes softened. "Thank you, Jennifer. You've been a great comfort to me. I won't forget your kindness." Jennifer left the room feeling content. She knew she had done the right thing. She had made a real difference in someone's life, not just through the care she provided, but through the time she had taken to connect with them on a human level. As she walked down the hall, Jennifer felt proud of the progress she had made. She had started out as just a nurse, focused on efficiency and getting through the work. But now she understood that her role was so much more than that. She was a caretaker, a listener, a source of support and comfort for the people she helped. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always straightforward. But Jennifer knew that with every patient she encountered, she had the opportunity to make a difference. And that, she realized, was what mattered most.